in the blink of an eye. Posted by Case by Case. Classes were still a week away, but I'd arrived at school early to move into my dorm. My parents, I may have been adopted, but they're still very much my parents, drove up for the day to help me set up my room. We met up with my boyfriend, Ryan, and his mom for an early dinner, and then they hit the road. Ryan said there was a party going on that night, and we should go. I'm not much of a partier, but he was excited and I didn't want to put a damper on his mood. It was rare for either of us to be excited about much, not after the incident, at the end of the summer. So I dressed up, put on makeup for once, and met him at the house. Luckily, it wasn't too crowded, as not all of the students had arrived on campus this early in the year. I actually started to enjoy myself, and by the end of the night, I was sitting snugly on a couch in a room with about 7 other students, swapping stories and telling jokes. I have to tell you, ever since the incident, Ryan has become very interested in the paranormal. At first, I thought he was just trying to figure out what had happened to us, but he started researching more and more true paranormal events. To be honest, I find it somewhat fascinating as well, but it's also terrifying. Maybe it's best to stay away. So I can't say I was very surprised when I heard Ryan say, "Does anyone have any scary stories? Like, real ones?" I glared at him, thinking he meant to start telling everyone our story. But he stayed quiet and waited for someone to speak up. My eyes fell on a girl sitting across from me. She was thin, with light brown skin and black hair. She'd been pretty quiet all night, but when Ryan said this, her eyes widened. She opened her mouth as if she were about to speak, when the burly football player next to her said, "Yeah, anyone hear about the one with the mental patient and the old lady?" He went on to tell some cliché tale of some late-night hitchhiker, but I kept my eye on the girl. She looked worried and distracted the whole rest of the night, and just as everyone was leaving, I pulled her aside. "You looked like you had something to say back there," I said. "Whatever it is, I'll believe you." A flicker of doubt crossed her face, and I thought maybe she'd brush it off. But she took a swig of her beer and began to tell her story. "I'm in nursing school, and I've been interning at a nearby hospital over the summer. None of the cases really stood out much until this one guy came in about 4 days ago. He had no prior history of mental illness, and his drug tests were clean, but he was having these strange hallucinations. The man said that every time he closed his eyes, he could see a forest, clear as day. It sounded like a very vivid hallucination, like he was standing right there in the woods. According to this man, it looked just like the woods he'd been camping in a few days earlier, but he wasn't sure. That's not what made him get help, though. He said the woods he could deal with, but what terrified him more than anything was when he saw a figure in the distance, shrouded in fog in the depths of the forest. At first, he wasn't even sure it was a figure until the figure started coming closer. The movement was imperceptible at first, but after about a day it was close enough that he could make out some details. It looked like it had long black hair, and it was wearing a tattered white sheet. He couldn't make out the face, not yet at least. So every time this man slept, or even blinked, he saw this scene. He thought there could be something wrong with his eyes, but his eye doctor sent him straight to our hospital. I think he was embarrassed that there could be something mentally, wrong with him, so at first he didn't want to give us many details, until the figure's face came into view. 2 days ago, I came into work, and the man was screaming his head off. 3 nurses had to hold him down and sedate him, and finally, when he'd calmed down, he described to us the full extent of the hallucinations. The figure was now about 30 feet away from him, and he could see it clearly now. It's tattered, dirty sheet hung halfway down its calves, and it walked on blistered, bare feet. Its nails, on both the hands and feet, were long, yellowed, and jagged. The stringy, matted hair hung straight down, stopping just above the frayed hem of the sheet. I listened calmly as he described the hallucination, but when he got to the face, my hair stood up on end. The skin was white and cracked, and the eye sockets were hollow, cavernous holes. The mouth was filled with long, stained teeth. They weren't sharp, but they were numerous. There were too many teeth to even fit in the mouth. Some had poked right through the lips and kept growing, curving to fit over one another. Even though the eye sockets were empty, he knew it was looking straight at him. We tried to give him treatment, but so far nothing's been working. We had to keep him tied down so he doesn't try to hurt himself, and he's been kept fairly sedated. She took another sip of her beer and looked straight at me. Yesterday was my last day at the internship. I stopped by his room as I was leaving. He was still pretty drugged, but he asked me to come over. I asked how he was doing, and he said, "It's standing 3 feet in front of me now. It's close enough to touch." I got chills when she said that. "You don't think it's just a hallucination, do you?" I asked her, already knowing the answer. "I know I don't have much medical experience," she replied, "but there was something about this case. It just doesn't seem right. And he had this friend come in to visit a couple of times, and from what I overheard..." She shook her head, and I knew she was done with her story. As I left the party with Ryan, I told him what she'd said. He listened intently, and when I was done, he asked which hospital it was. "You have got to be kidding me." I was angry. I knew he was thinking about visiting the man, and for what? To get his kicks from the poor guy's terror? "Casey, don't be mad," Ryan said and turned to face me. "It's not that I think this is a joke or a game. We both know how scary it is when things happen that we can't explain. But we've faced the unknown before, and we made it. I want to help other people make it. Maybe I won't even be able to do anything, but at least I will have tried." I sighed. I knew he meant what he said, even though it was an idiotic idea. "I'll come with you." The next day, I found out the right hospital and the patient's name from a mutual friend of the girl at the party. Ryan and I drove out that afternoon and made it just after visiting hours had started. When we stopped at the front desk, the receptionist said, "Oh, Matt's getting a lot of visitors today." Ryan and I exchanged looks. Could she mean the same visitor mentioned at the party? We made our way to the hospital room. The door was ajar, so we peered in. A man was lying in a bed. There were restraints attached to the bed, but at the moment his arms were free. The man's eyes were red, and he was using his fingers to keep them pried open. He was whispering urgently with another man, sitting in a chair next to the bed. At one point, his fingers slipped and his eyes shut briefly. I swear I heard him say, "It's inches away from my face." Ryan and I hovered outside the door, unsure of what to do. It suddenly felt very wrong that we were here, good intentions or not. Here was a man in anguish, and we had no clue how to help him. As we turned to leave, I heard a shrill cry coming from the room. Spinning around, I saw the man in the chair had leapt back a few feet from the bed. His friend, still strapped to the bed by his feet, seemed to be clawing at something, or was he clawing at his own face? His face was bloody, and in the few seconds I stopped and stared, unable to react, it became more and more mangled. Ryan snapped out of it before I did, and called an orderly over. More rushed in, and the man's friend cleared the room, very distraught. He ran his hands through his hair and covered his mouth like he might be sick. Presently, he noticed Ryan and me standing anxiously beside him and glanced at our visitor badges. "You're friends of Matt's?" he asked. I hesitated before telling the truth. No, we just thought maybe we'd be able to help. The man laughed a nervous laugh, shook his head, and said, "There is no help." Just then, one of the nurses came out of the room. I realized that the screaming had stopped, and I peeked in to see if Matt had been restrained. I immediately regretted looking, and the nurse said simply, "He's gone." Matt's friend took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He then opened them instantly and absently reached up to pull at his eyelids with his hand. He has the same problem, I thought. "Maybe there is nothing we can do to help," I told him pointedly, "but you should let us try." The man pursed his lips and then nodded once. The three of us headed down to the cafeteria and grabbed a secluded table in the back corner of the room. He introduced himself as Victor and proceeded to tell us his tale. Me, Matt, and our friend Derek went camping in the woods north of here. We'd gone camping plenty of times before, but never in this area. So the first night, we drive as far into the woods as we can on this dirt road, and then walk a couple miles into the forest. We find a nice little clearing and pitch the tent. The first night was fine, except Matt was a dumbass and spilled about half of our water supply. We didn't want to walk all the way back to the truck and drive back into town, so I said we should look around for a stream or something, and we'd just sterilize the water. So we're all a bit spread out in the woods, looking for a stream, when I hear Derek shout. I head on over, and Derek's standing by this little, rundown shack, right there in the middle of the goddamn woods. It doesn't look like anyone's been using it for a while, and it's empty inside. Derek starts looking around for a water pump when I hear Matt come crashing through the trees. He calls us over to the other side of the shack. I go, but Derek keeps looking for a pump. On Matt's side of the shack, there's what looks like an old fire pit, but right in the middle of all the ash and soot, there's this clay pot. Only, it's not a pot. It's sealed all the way around like there might be something in it. Matt picks it up, looks at it for a minute, and then throws it to the ground, breaking it. At that second, there's a blinding flash of light. I thought it was lightning, but the weather was fine, and then everything's dark for a few seconds. Matt says, "Did you see that?" I think he's talking about the lightning, so I say, "Yeah, that was bright. What do you think it was?" Then I notice something on the ground where Matt dropped the pot, so I kneel down and sift through the pieces. Geez, are these teeth? No, I think I saw someone out in the woods for a second, Matt said. Wait, did you say teeth? There was a handful of long, yellow teeth among the broken clay shards. Matt and I are seriously freaking out, and Derek finally comes back over and we decide to go home. We weren't that scared, but since our water was low anyway. That night, I have this weird dream where all I see is the woods. Not like I'm walking through the woods, but like I just have this one view all night. It was like the lightning strike burned the image into my retinas. When I woke up, I could still see it when I blinked. I talked to Matt, and he said the same thing. Next thing I know, Matt's here in the hospital, saying something's walking towards him in the vision. And then, well, you know the rest. Only, I haven't seen the figure yet, so I guess I'm okay for now. Have you talked to Derek? Ryan asked. Once a couple days later, but he didn't want to talk about it. He sounded scared though, so I wonder if he's going through the same thing. Hey, maybe he talked to you. Let me give you his number. Victor jotted the name and number down and leaned back in his chair. He seemed pretty calm given the situation, I thought, and I wondered if that's because it's been all this time and he hasn't seen the figure yet. Then something occurred to me. You said it was like the lightning strike burned the image into your eyes, I said. Do you remember which way you were facing when you saw the flash in the woods? Yeah. Victor sounded confused. The fire pit was just in front of me, and Matt was standing to my left, right next to me, but just out of sight. Can you look around when you close your eyes? Like, could you look down and see the fire pit? I hadn't really thought of that. Let me try. Victor seemed uneasy as he shut his eyes. Okay, I see the woods. Now I'm looking down and there it is. It's the fire pit. Jeez, you're right. I'm standing exactly where I was when we saw the flash. I grinned. We were actually getting somewhere. Ryan said, "Can you look to your left? Maybe see where Matt is." I'm trying to. I think he was standing just out of sight though. Victor paused, his brow furrowed, eyes still clenched shut. No, wait, I see something. I think it's Matt, only he's wearing white. And oh God, no. Victor jumped out of his seat, screaming at the top of his lungs. Ryan grabbed me and pulled me away from his flailing arms. In horror, I saw Victor scratch at his eyes, trying to tear them right out of his skull. I couldn't be sure, but before I looked away, I thought I saw scratches or even teeth marks appearing on Victor's face, even after security guards had held his arms down. Ryan and I were questioned, as we'd been near both Matt and Victor when they died. There wasn't evidence that we were to blame for any of it, so they let us go home. As we left, I overheard a nurse saying it looked like both men had scratches on their hands, like they'd been trying to fend someone or something off. We sat in silence for the drive back to our dorms, but as we were getting out of the car, Ryan handed me a slip of paper. It was Derek's phone number. "I'm not going to drag you into this anymore. It's really dangerous, and I know that now," Ryan said. "It's up to you what you want to do with this." I took the paper. "We both know how scary it is when things happen that we can't explain," Ryan had said. "I want to help other people make it." Without giving myself time to second-guess my decision, I picked up my cell and dialed the number. "Hi, is this Derek? I'm a friend, and I want to help." Derek agreed to meet us at his house that very night. It was about 2 hours away, so I grabbed a book from my school reading list. I wasn't going to let some paranormal rescue mission distract me from my classes, and read as Ryan drove us north to Derek's house. It was just after dusk when we arrived. He was leaning against the porch when we arrived and came over with his hand outstretched. "Derek, nice to meet you." He was tall and fit, in his late 20s, I guessed, but he had dark circles under his eyes and looked like he hadn't eaten in days. "Casey," I said as I shook his hand, and Ryan introduced himself as well. "You've heard Victor's story already, have you? I'm not sure I can add much to it, and I'm hoping you have a plan in mind, because I gotta tell you, I'm clueless here." "So you are seeing the same vision Victor and Matt saw?" I asked, and Derek nodded. He seemed to want to add something, but remained quiet. I continued, "Well, we still don't know exactly what we're dealing with, but Ryan and I thought it'd be helpful if we went back into the woods where it all started. We won't even be able to find the shack in the dark, but if you two can stay till tomorrow, we can go then," Derek said. "I don't know if it's safe for you to wait that long. I mean, it got Victor and Matt just this morning." I began, but Derek cut me off. "We have time." I got chills when I realized what he meant. Ryan understood as well and said, "You can see the figure, can't you? It hasn't reached you yet." Derek sighed. "Why don't you come inside? I'll tell you everything." We stepped over a small pile of unread newspapers on the porch and went inside. The house wasn't exactly messy, but it had the feel of a once tidy place that hadn't been taken care of in a week or so. I imagined Derek had much more pressing matters on his mind. I noticed a gun sitting out and was nervous until I saw a police badge and jacket hanging nearby. With a sympathetic pang, I wondered if he'd left the gun out as a last resort. Not that a gun would work on the vision, but on himself perhaps. Once in the living room, Derek motioned for us to sit on the couch. He took the armchair facing us and began his story. I'm sure Victor told you everything he knew already, but I've had a somewhat different perspective. When Victor, Matt, and I split up in the woods to look for a stream, I headed west of our campsite. I wasn't too familiar with these woods, but I'd heard stories of an old hermit and his daughter who used to live out here, so I thought there must be some sort of water source, like a well of some sort. I was still surprised when I actually found the shack, so I called out for Matt and Victor to come look. I ducked into the shed for a minute, and it was empty. As I turned to step out, I noticed a scrap of paper on the ground, half buried under dirt and dried leaves. I picked it up and turned it over. It was an old photo. Looking at the photo, I remembered more to the story of the old man and his daughter. The girl had been deformed and was mocked and ridiculed by the other children and even the adults in the town. The bitter old man locked her away in the forest, and after some time, he disappeared as well. People assumed he'd gone to live in the woods with his daughter, but no one knew for sure because they were never seen again. But the photo itself was of an old man standing next to a shorter figure. I couldn't tell for sure if it was the daughter or not, because it had a frayed burlap sack over its head. Below the sack, I could see it was wearing a long, white dress, and it had straight, black hair that fell to its waist. It really creeped me out, so I dropped the photo and stepped out of the shack. Victor was there, and I told him the shack was empty. I still wanted to find a well or a water pump, so I kept looking. I heard Matt calling from the other side of the shack, and Victor went over to investigate. After a minute, I'd circled the clearing for a bit and was now in view of Matt, but still about 30 yards away. Matt and Victor were standing next to each other, and Matt was holding something. Victor turned away for a split second, and I saw Matt throw the object to the ground. I heard a shattering noise, and at the same time, there was a blinding flash of light. Ryan and I nodded. We'd heard this part. I spoke up. Yeah. Victor said the next night it was like the flash of light had burned the vision of the forest into your eyes, and you'd see it every time you close your eyes. We figured out you were seeing what you'd been looking at the exact moment of the flash. Yes, and I knew that from the start, Derek said, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw Matt and Victor standing in the woods by the shack. It was like a still picture. They weren't moving at all. Then, the next day, I started to see something out of the corner of my eye, a figure slowly advancing towards them. I shivered, my eyes wide. I felt Ryan tense next to me. Derek continued. It moved so slowly, I could barely tell that it was moving at all. But each time I closed my eyes, it was just a little bit closer. First 30 yards, then 20, and then in a couple days it was standing just feet away from them. Victor called me to say Matt was in the hospital, and he was having hallucinations. I hung up before he had a chance to explain further. I knew exactly what Matt was seeing, and I just couldn't bring myself to tell Victor that the creature was right next to him as well, even though he couldn't see it. Then, although I'd been doing my best to keep from sleeping, to avoid seeing this vision, I gave in to exhaustion and fell asleep this morning. I watched as the creature took the final steps, no, more like it floated, towards Matt. In my vision, Matt and Victor had been perfectly still up until now, but when the creature reached out and grabbed his face and sunk its many, many teeth right into his skull, Matt began to thrash and flail wildly. I couldn't hear anything, but he must have been screaming. The creature slashed at his face with its long, sharp nails, and momentarily Matt stilled and slumped to the ground. He fell facing me, his face a mangled mass of pulpy, red flesh. Then I watched in horror as the creature turned and slowly, ever so slowly, bridged the gap between it and Victor. Victor didn't even see it coming. It was over in less than a minute. I willed myself to wake up. I couldn't stand to watch another second when Derek's voice shook as he said this next part. It turned to face me, and ever since, it's been slowly coming towards me, across the clearing. It's almost halfway there. Neither Ryan nor I could speak for some time. It was so much to take in. Finally, Ryan asked, "How long until it reaches you?" I've been trying to work that out. I think I have at least until late afternoon, maybe evening tomorrow. If you think we need to head out to the woods, let's leave tomorrow morning, before sunrise. Yeah, I think we definitely need to go back to that shack, I said. I'll be honest, we may be in over our heads here, but we'll do what we can to help. First, we need to get an idea of what this thing is. Maybe a demon, or a ghost of some sort. And we'll need to find out how to kill it, or trap it, or something. You do have internet here, right? We spent most of the rest of the night researching demons and other supernatural entities online. Derek had already done some research, and I was surprised Ryan had been doing a good deal of reading ever since our incident. To my dismay, we couldn't find anything that sounded just like the figure in the woods, but we found a great deal of information on trapping spirits and getting rid of demons. There was a lot of contradicting information, but in a few hours we had the beginnings of a plan. Around 3 a.m., I took a short nap on the couch while Ryan and Derek discussed the plan further. Net thing I knew, Ryan was gently shaking me awake. He whispered, "It's time to go." The first rays of daylight peeked over the horizon as we turned onto the dirt road. Derek was driving his pickup truck, and Ryan and I were squashed together in the front seat. Derek stopped the car when the road dead-ended. We went on foot from there. It wasn't exactly easy finding the shack again. Derek found the campsite okay. We knew it was the right place because they'd left some things there. The guys must have really left in a hurry. We split up, and this time, I was the one to find the shack. It was just as dilapidated as Derek had described, and after I'd yelled for the boys, I couldn't help but step inside. Right there in the middle of the floor was the photo. It was lying face up, and I shuddered when I saw the figure in the burlap sack and the old man standing next to it. The man's face looked severe. I left the photo lying there and stepped back outside. Ryan and Derek were waiting. Now we began to put the plan in motion. Derek walked over to where he had been standing when he saw the flash. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, opening them intermittently to make sure he was in the right spot, facing the right way. His face paled and his skin broke out into a sheen of sweat, but he determinedly stayed calm and adjusted himself until he was in place. "Okay," he said, and pointed to a spot on the ground about 15 feet in front of him, his hand shaking. "It's right there." I knew my face had to be white as a sheet, but I would not let myself freak out. Ryan looked like he was in the same boat. Our eyes met, and he gave me an encouraging grin. "Here we go." While researching ways to stop, or destroy, a demon, we noticed there were two ways that stayed pretty consistent, no matter what we were reading. One was fire, used to destroy, to break down whatever it was that made up these horrific entities until there was nothing left. The other was salt, used to keep away bad spirits. We were wary of mixing the two, though, so we thought we'd start with just fire. Plus, the clay pot with the teeth in it was found in a fire pit, so maybe that'd help keep the creature at bay before. Ryan pulled a ball of yarn, a bottle of kerosene, and matches out of his backpack. He handed me the matches. We didn't want the same person who handled the kerosene to then strike a match, and he proceeded to douse the yarn in kerosene. He then draped the yarn in a complete circle around where Derek had pointed. "Is it standing in the circle?" Ryan asked. Derek nodded shakily. I was terrified to be standing right next to some invisible being, but I wasn't going to be the first one to panic. Not yet, at least. I knelt down and lit the match. In seconds, the flames had spread around the perimeter of the circle. "Is anything happening?" I asked Derek, his eyes still shut. "No, not yet. It's slow though. Give it a minute." "Wait, I think it stopped. It's not moving past the flames." Derek was excited. Ryan and I exchanged triumphant looks. "No, wait. It's doing something now. It's kneeling down. No, it's crouching. It's going to jump." Derek was frantic now. I could tell he wanted to run away. "Stay where you are, so we know where it is," I shouted and grabbed the backpack. I'll make a salt circle around Derek, I thought. That was supposed to be good protection. I fumbled around in the backpack, grasping for the container. It's out of the circle. It's running toward me. Derek's yell seemed to shake the trees around the clearing. I have no idea how he managed, but Derek stayed put. Finally, my fingers found the salt container and pulled it free. There was no time. I ripped the top off and flung the entire container at the empty air directly in front of Derek. At that exact moment, I saw 3 fresh gashes appear on Derek's face. Salt sprayed through the air, showering the ground around us. And a strange thing happened. The air seemed to fizzle right in front of Derek, sputtering like something. Dissolving in acid, the form became clearer. It was a figure about 6 or 7 feet tall. Derek struggled and screamed, "Light it on fire." Ryan jumped forward, kerosene bottle in hand, and doused the creature as fast as he could. I reached for the matchbook, but Ryan was quicker. He led a trail of kerosene to the still-burning circle of fire, and soon the hulking form was ablaze. Derek looked back. I heard a shrill whistle, like steam escaping from a kettle. Or maybe it was a high-pitched scream. I absently worried that we would start a forest fire, but the flames seemed to diminish rather than spread. The figure was still fully engulfed in the fire, but I was able to make out a mass of hair, a smattering of teeth. Then the fire shrank until there was only a pile of soot on the ground and some strange, pale objects. I looked closer. They were teeth. Derek lay on the ground, gasping. There was blood on his face, but I could only make out about 5 distinct gashes. As I watched, he slowly blinked, and a smile spread across his face. "It's gone." Ryan wordlessly opened the backpack and got out the final object, a small box latched with a padlock. The 3 of us gathered all of the teeth from the pile of ash, along with the original ones from the fire pit, and locked them up. The final thing we did was burn the photo in the shack. Derek drove us back to his house. Despite all the terror we had just experienced, we were thrilled to have survived. We spent the ride going over the events, chiming in with each little detail we'd missed, and actually having a good time. It was the high of success, and we were enjoying it. Derek said goodbye as Ryan and I got in my car, and we promised to keep in touch. He kept the box of teeth with him for safekeeping. I don't know if he'll always keep it close or hide it, but I do know the scars on his face will always be with him. As we drove back to the dorms, the high began to wear off, and the terror crept up again. I wondered if Ryan's passion for the paranormal was sated, or if we'd find ourselves in another, possibly more dangerous situation. I sighed as my eyelids grew heavy, and the dim shadow of sleep crept closer. There would be nightmares to fend off tonight. I closed my eyes.